The date was November 29, 1970, and two university professors were hiking through one of Norway's most desolate and forbidding landscapes when they stumbled upon something that would haunt Norwegian investigators for decades to come. In a remote valley outside Bergen, hidden among the rocks and steep terrain of Isdal, the ice valley, they found the partially burned remains of a woman. But this wasn't just another tragic death in the wilderness. This was the beginning of what would become one of Europe's most perplexing cold cases. A mystery so bizarre and intricate that it reads like a spy thriller. Except every detail is chillingly real. The woman lying in that valley had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase her identity. And more than 50 years later, we still don't know who she was, where she came from, or why she died in such mysterious circumstances. When the police arrived at the scene, they immediately knew something was deeply wrong. The woman's body was found in a rocky area, severely burned, lying on her back in what investigators would later describe as a pugilistic position, the characteristic pose bodies assume when exposed to intense heat. Around her were the remnants of what appeared to be a deliberate fire. Several bottles, including what was identified as gasoline containers, were scattered near the body. Her face was damaged beyond recognition, not just from the fire, but in a way that suggested deliberate disfigurement. But it was what the investigators found when they examined her more closely that transformed this from a tragic death into something far more sinister. Every single label had been meticulously cut from her clothing. Every tag, every brand marker, every identifying feature had been removed with surgical precision. Even her fingerprints had been burned away, making identification through conventional means virtually impossible. The initial investigation revealed details that only deepened the mystery. The woman was estimated to be between 30 and 40 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, with long dark hair. She was found wearing a distinctive combination of items: a night dress, jewelry including rings and a watch, and oddly, no shoes despite the harsh terrain. Near her body, investigators discovered a dozen pink and brown fentanyl sleeping pills scattered on the ground, and the autopsy would later reveal that she had consumed between 50 and 70 of these barbiturate pills before her death. The toxicology report showed significant levels of phenobarbital in her system, enough to be lethal on its own. But there was more. Carbon monoxide was detected in her blood, indicating she had been alive, at least to some degree, when the fire started. The coroner couldn't definitively determine whether this was suicide, murder, or something in between, but the elaborate staging suggested this was no ordinary death. The investigation took an even stranger turn when police began tracking the woman's movements in the days and weeks before her death. Using witness statements and hotel records, they pieced together a bizarre trail of deception and evasion. The woman had been traveling throughout Norway and other European countries, checking into various hotels under different names, using what appeared to be fake identities. She had stayed in several hotels in Bergen itself, always paying in cash, always giving vague or contradictory information about herself. Staff members who encountered her described her as nervous, secretive, and constantly looking over her shoulder. She would change her appearance frequently, sometimes wearing wigs, sometimes styling her hair differently, as if actively trying to avoid being recognized or tracked. One hotel receptionist recalled that she seemed educated and spoke multiple languages fluently, including German, English, and what sounded like French or possibly Flemish Dutch. When investigators located her luggage, which had been stored at the Bergen train station, they found items that only deepened the enigma. Inside her suitcases were multiple sets of clothing, all with the labels carefully removed. There were several wigs in different colors and styles, suggesting she had been regularly changing her appearance. Most intriguingly, they found coded notes, written in what appeared to be a simple substitution cipher. When cryptographers finally decoded these notes, they revealed a list of places and dates, a travel itinerary of sorts. But the purpose of these travels remained unclear. The handwriting was neat and methodical, suggesting someone organized and deliberate. Among her belongings were also multiple pairs of glasses, cosmetics, and personal items, but absolutely nothing that could definitively identify who she was. No letters, no photographs of family or friends, no business cards or personal documents. It was as if this woman had deliberately stripped away every connection to her real identity before arriving in that valley. Perhaps most haunting were the false passports and identity documents investigators eventually connected to her. She had been using at least 8 different aliases during her travels, with names that suggested she was claiming to be from various European countries. The passports were sophisticated forgeries, not the crude fakes one might obtain from petty criminals, but professional-grade documents that would have required significant resources and expertise to produce. This suggested involvement with either intelligence agencies or serious organized crime. The woman had checked into hotels under names like Fenella Lork from Belgium, Claudia Gelt, and other aliases that investigators would painstakingly track across Europe. Each identity came with its own backstory, its own signature, its own carefully constructed persona. But behind all these masks was a woman whose true name remained, and remains to this day, completely unknown. The investigation expanded across Europe as police tried to identify the mysterious woman. Interpol was contacted, and her description and post-mortem photographs were circulated to law enforcement agencies across the continent. Surely someone, somewhere, must be missing this woman, a family member, a friend, a colleague, an employer. But the response was silence. No one came forward to identify her. No missing persons reports matched her description. It was as if she had never existed, or more disturbing, as if everyone who might have known her had deliberately chosen to remain silent. In the Cold War atmosphere of 1970, with Europe still divided by the Iron Curtain and espionage activities at their peak, investigators began to seriously consider that they were dealing with something far beyond an ordinary crime. The Isdal Woman, as she would come to be known, might have been a spy, an informant, or someone caught up in the shadowy world of international intelligence. The investigation into the Isdal Woman's final days revealed a pattern of behavior that was as methodical as it was mysterious. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had moved through Norway with the precision of someone following a carefully planned itinerary. Yet her actions suggested someone desperately trying to avoid detection. Detectives began reconstructing her movements by interviewing hotel staff, taxi drivers, and shopkeepers who had encountered her. What emerged was a portrait of a woman living multiple lives simultaneously, constantly shifting between identities as if she were an actress performing different roles. She would check into a hotel under one name, leave her luggage there, and then check into another hotel nearby under a completely different identity. This pattern repeated itself across Bergen and other Norwegian cities, creating a complex web of aliases and locations that investigators struggled to untangle. Witnesses who had interacted with the woman provided descriptions that were consistent in some ways and contradictory in others. Most agreed that she appeared to be well-educated and cultured, with impeccable manners and a sophisticated demeanor. She spoke several languages fluently, switching between them with ease depending on whom she was addressing. Some described her as attractive with dark hair, while others remembered her as wearing obvious wigs in various colors. Her clothing was described as expensive and fashionable for the era, suggesting she had access to significant financial resources. One hotel porter recalled helping her with heavy suitcases and noting that she seemed nervous and kept checking the lobby as if watching for someone. A taxi driver who had driven her to various locations around Bergen remembered that she had asked him to take indirect routes and had repeatedly looked through the rear window, behavior he found odd enough to remember years later when police interviewed him. The coded notes found in her luggage became a focal point of the investigation. When cryptanalysis experts examined them, they discovered that the cipher was relatively simple, a basic substitution code where letters were replaced with other letters according to a consistent pattern. Once decoded, The notes revealed what appeared to be a detailed travel schedule covering multiple European cities over several months. The entries included place names, dates, and what investigators believed were meeting times or appointments, though the purpose of these meetings remained unclear. Some entries mentioned locations in Norway, while others referenced cities in Germany, France, and Belgium. The meticulous nature of these records suggested someone engaged in systematic travel for a specific purpose, whether that was business, espionage, or something else entirely. What struck investigators as particularly significant was that this woman was clearly intelligent and organized enough to maintain such detailed records, yet she had taken no steps to hide or destroy these notes before her death, almost as if she no longer cared whether they were found. The autopsy results raised as many questions as they answered. The forensic pathologist who examined the body confirmed that the woman had died from a combination of the massive dose of sleeping pills and carbon monoxide inhalation from the fire. However, the sequence of events remained puzzling. The amount of phenobarbital in her system was lethal on its own, yet she had apparently remained conscious long enough to either set fire to herself or be present when someone else did. The position of the body and the distribution of burns suggested she had been lying down when the fire started, but there were no signs of struggle or defensive wounds that would indicate she had tried to escape the flames. The jewelry she wore, including rings and a watch, had partially melted in the heat. An examination of these items revealed that any engravings or manufacturer marks had been filed away, continuing the pattern of deliberate identity erasure that characterized every aspect of this case. One of the most perplexing aspects of the investigation was the location itself. Isdal Woman was not an easily accessible area, particularly in late November when the weather was cold and the terrain treacherous. To reach the spot where the body was found required considerable effort, hiking through difficult landscape far from any roads or buildings. This raised immediate questions about how the woman had arrived there. If she had walked, where had she come from, and why choose such a remote location? If someone had brought her there, either voluntarily or by force, why had no witnesses seen anything suspicious? The valley was known to locals as an eerie, isolated place that few people visited, especially as winter approached. That the woman, or her killer if there was one, had chosen this specific location seemed significant, suggesting either intimate knowledge of the area or a desperate need for absolute privacy. As the investigation expanded internationally, Norwegian police worked closely with Interpol and law enforcement agencies across Western Europe. The woman's description, dental records, and post-mortem photographs were circulated widely. Investigators were particularly interested in missing persons cases from Germany, Belgium, and France. Given the languages she spoke and some of the aliases she had used, they contacted hotels and cities mentioned in her coded notes, trying to verify whether she had stayed at these locations and what names she might have used. Some establishments confirmed that a woman matching her description had been a guest, always paying cash, always keeping to herself, never receiving visitors or mail. But none of this detective work brought them any closer to discovering her real name or country of origin. Every lead seemed to dissolve into more questions, every answer revealing another layer of deception. The psychological profile that investigators developed painted a picture of someone living under immense stress. The constant identity changes, the elaborate precautions against identification, the coded notes, and the apparent paranoia all suggested a person who believed she was in danger or being watched. Some psychologists consulted on the case proposed that she might have been suffering from mental illness, perhaps a delusional disorder that made her believe she was being pursued when she was not. However, the professional quality of her forged documents and the systematic nature of her activities argued against simple mental illness. If she was paranoid, there seemed to be some basis for her fears, something real driving her elaborate security measures. Other experts suggested she might have been involved in espionage or working as a courier for intelligence services, explaining both her behavior and the strange circumstances of her death. In the context of 1970, with Cold War tensions running high in Norway's strategic position between NATO and the Soviet Union, such theories were not as far-fetched as they might seem. The physical evidence collected at the scene was extensive, but ultimately inconclusive. Besides the bottles and the sleeping pills, investigators found remnants of burned clothing and personal items, all carefully cataloged and analyzed. Soil samples from the scene were taken, and the area was thoroughly photographed and mapped. Yet despite all this meticulous police work, the evidence failed to answer the fundamental questions. Who was this woman, and what had brought her to such a lonely death in the Ice Valley? The theories about the Isdal Woman's identity and the circumstances of her death began to multiply. As the investigation dragged on without resolution, Norwegian authorities found themselves grappling with a case that seemed to defy conventional investigative methods. Every traditional approach to identification had been deliberately thwarted by someone, whether the woman herself or another party, who possessed both the means and the motivation to ensure she remained anonymous. The Cold War context of the early 1970s inevitably colored the interpretation of the evidence. Norway, despite its official neutrality, occupied a crucial geographic position in Northern Europe, sharing a border with the Soviet Union and serving as a member of NATO. The country had already experienced several espionage incidents, and the security services were acutely aware that their territory was used by intelligence agencies from both sides of the Iron Curtain. Against this backdrop, the theory that the Isdal Woman was somehow connected to the shadowy world of spies and intelligence gathering gained considerable traction among investigators. Supporting the espionage theory were several compelling pieces of evidence. The false passports and multiple identities were exactly the kind of tradecraft employed by intelligence operatives who needed to move between countries without leaving a clear trail. Decoded travel notes, while simple in their encryption, demonstrated operational security awareness, a habit of documenting activities in a way that would be meaningless to casual observers. Her pattern of hotel stays, never remaining in one place for long and often maintaining rooms in multiple locations, simultaneously mirrored the behavior of agents seeking to create confusion about their whereabouts. The removal of all identifying labels from clothing and personal items was another classic intelligence technique, designed to prevent adversaries from tracking purchases back to specific locations or establishing patterns of movement. Even her linguistic abilities, fluently speaking multiple European languages, fit the profile of someone recruited for international intelligence work. Some investigators speculated that she might have been a courier, someone tasked with moving documents or information between handlers in different countries, which would explain her extensive travels and the methodical nature of her itinerary. However, alternative theories also emerged that painted a very different picture of the Isdal Woman's situation. Some investigators believe she might have been fleeing from something or someone, possibly an abusive relationship or involvement with dangerous criminal organizations. This theory suggested that her elaborate identity concealment was not professional tradecraft, but rather the desperate measures of someone trying to disappear from a threatening situation. The removal of identifying information and the use of multiple aliases could indicate a woman trying to escape a violent partner, a criminal organization she had become entangled with, or even witness protection arrangements that had somehow failed. Proponents of this theory pointed to the apparent stress and paranoia witnesses had observed in her behavior, the constant looking over her shoulder, the nervous demeanor, the circuitous routes she requested from taxi drivers. These seemed less like the confident movements of a trained operative, and more like the fearful actions of someone being hunted. The suicide versus murder debate remained unresolved and deeply contentious among the investigators and forensic experts involved in the case. Those who believed it was suicide pointed to the massive quantity of sleeping pills she had consumed, which suggested a deliberate attempt to end her life. The remote location could be interpreted as someone seeking privacy for a final act, not wanting to be disturbed or discovered until it was too late for intervention. The fire might have been started by the woman herself as a way to ensure death and perhaps to further obscure her identity even in death, completing the erasure she had begun in life. Some psychologists suggested that someone living under the intense pressure of maintaining multiple identities and constantly evading detection might eventually reach a breaking point, seeing no way out except death. The methodical preparation, bringing the pills, the gasoline, traveling to such an isolated location, could all be interpreted as the careful planning of someone determined to die on their own terms. Yet the murder theory had equally strong proponents who pointed to troubling inconsistencies in the suicide narrative. The sheer difficulty of reaching the location where she was found raised questions about whether a woman who had consumed a lethal dose of sleeping pills could have made such a journey. The terrain was challenging enough for a healthy person in full control of their faculties. For someone heavily sedated, it seemed nearly impossible. Some investigators argue that she must have been transported to the location, either already deceased or in a severely incapacitated state, and that the fire was set by someone else to destroy evidence. The position of the body and the distribution of the fire damage struck some forensic experts as inconsistent with self-immolation. Additionally, if this was suicide, why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not simply overdose in a hotel room? The theatrical nature of the death scene, the remote location, the fire, the scatter pills, seemed to some investigators like staging, an attempt to make murder look like suicide while simultaneously preventing identification. Third, more nuanced theory proposed that the truth lays somewhere between murder and suicide, that the woman might have been coerced or manipulated into taking her own life. In the intelligence community, there were historical precedents for operatives who had become liabilities being encouraged to commit suicide rather than being directly assassinated. This avoided the messiness of murder while still eliminating a problem. If the Isdal Woman had been involved in espionage and had somehow compromised herself, perhaps by being exposed by threatening to defect or by becoming unreliable, her handlers might have given her an ultimatum: suicide or something worse, possibly threats against family members or loved ones. This theory could explain the seemingly contradictory evidence. The deliberate preparation suggesting suicide, combined with elements that didn't quite fit a straightforward self-inflicted death. As months turned into years, the active investigation gradually wound down. Though the case was never officially closed, the Norwegian police had exhausted their conventional leads, and without a positive identification, there was little more they could do. Periodic reviews of the case over the following decades yielded no breakthroughs. The case gradually faded from public consciousness in Norway, becoming one of those unsolved mysteries that occasionally surfaced in true crime discussions but generated little active interest. The original investigators retired or moved on to other cases, taking with them their theories and hunches about what had really happened in Isdal in that November. The Isdal Woman case might have remained a forgotten footnote in Norwegian criminal history, if not for advances in forensic science and renewed public interest in cold cases that emerged in the 21st century. Decades after the original investigation had stalled, new technologies offered the possibility of extracting information from evidence that had seemed exhausted of its secrets. In 2016, nearly 50 years after the woman's death, Norwegian journalists and investigators launched a renewed effort to identify her, utilizing modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1970. This revival of interest brought the case back into the public eye, and demonstrated how dramatically investigative capabilities had evolved. The zinc coffin in which she had been buried proved to be a prescient decision, as it had helped preserve the remains far better than a conventional burial would have done, making new forensic analysis possible. One of the most promising new approaches involved isotope analysis, a technique that can reveal where a person lived during different periods of their life. Based on the chemical composition of their teeth and bones, isotopes are variants of chemical elements that are absorbed into the body through food and water, and their ratios vary depending on geographic location and diet. By analyzing isotopes in the Isdal woman's teeth, which formed during childhood and remain unchanged throughout life, scientists could potentially determine where she had spent her early years. The results of this analysis suggested that she had likely grown up somewhere in Central Europe, possibly in the border region between Germany and France, or perhaps in parts of Belgium or Luxembourg. Her tooth enamel indicated exposure to water sources and dietary patterns consistent with these regions during her formative years. However, isotope analysis provides regions rather than specific locations, so while it narrowed down possibilities, it still left a vast area where she might have originated. DNA analysis represented another frontier in the reinvestigation. Genetic material was successfully extracted from the preserved remains, and a DNA profile was developed that could potentially be matched against databases or living relatives if they could be found. Investigators worked with genealogy experts who had pioneered genetic genealogy techniques, the same methods that had recently been used to identify the Golden State Killer in the United States after decades of mystery. The Isdal woman's DNA was compared against databases of missing persons and genealogical records, hoping to find matches with relatives who might have submitted their own DNA for ancestry testing. Unfortunately, these searches yielded no definitive matches. Either her relatives had not participated in genetic testing, or the woman came from a family line that was not well represented in existing databases. The lack of matches was frustrating, but not entirely surprising, particularly if she had come from Eastern Europe or regions where participation in commercial DNA testing was less common. The renewed investigation also involved re-examining the original evidence with fresh eyes and modern analytical tools. The coded notes were subjected to more sophisticated cryptographic analysis, and linguists studied the handwriting and language patterns for clues about her educational background and native language. Experts in historical fashion examined photographs of the clothing found with her body, identifying styles and manufacturing techniques that could narrow down where the garments had been purchased. Even the suitcases and personal items were reanalyzed, with investigators hoping that modern chemical analysis might reveal traces that 1970s forensics had missed. Some of these efforts yielded interesting details. For instance, analysis of pollen found on her clothing suggested she had recently been in areas with specific vegetation, but none provided the breakthrough that would reveal her identity. The podcast and media coverage of the reinvestigation brought forward new witnesses who had not been interviewed in 1970 or who had not realized the significance of their encounters with the mysterious woman. An elderly man came forward claiming he had seen a woman matching her description, hiking near Isdal on the day before the body was discovered, accompanied by two men in dark coats who seemed to be escorting her. However, his memory after so many years was understandably unclear, and investigators couldn't verify the account or determine if he had genuinely seen the Isdal woman or was conflating memories of different events. Other witnesses provided similar fragmentary recollections. A woman who seemed distressed at a bus stop, a foreign-sounding conversation overheard at a cafe. But none of these accounts could be definitively connected to the case or verified independently. Modern investigators also gained access to intelligence archives that had been classified in 1970, but had since been declassified or made available to researchers. They discovered that several intelligence agencies had indeed been operating actively in Norway during that period, and that there had been numerous covert operations involving agents from both NATO countries and the Soviet bloc. However, None of the agencies that responded to inquiries acknowledge having any knowledge of an operative, matching the Isdal Woman's description or circumstances. This silence could mean she truly had no connection to intelligence work, or it could mean that her involvement remained sensitive to acknowledge even decades later. Intelligence agencies are notoriously reluctant to confirm or deny information about past operations, particularly those that might have ended badly or involved compromised agents. The emotional dimension of the case also came into sharper focus with the renewed investigation. This was not merely an intellectual puzzle or a historical curiosity. It was the story of a real human being who had died alone and afraid in a remote valley, whose name had been lost, whose family had never learned what happened to her. The renewed attention brought poignant reflections on what her life must have been like. In those final weeks, moving from hotel to hotel, constantly looking over her shoulder, living under the weight of secrets that we can only guess at. Whether she was a spy, a victim fleeing danger, or someone caught in circumstances we still don't understand, her story represents a profound tragedy of anonymity and isolation. Someone, somewhere, must have loved this woman, must have wondered what became of her, must have searched for her when she disappeared from their lives. The Isdal Woman's case remains officially unsolved, her true identity still unknown despite decades of investigation and the application of cutting-edge forensic science. She represents one of those enduring mysteries that continue to fascinate and frustrate in equal measure. But her story also serves as a reminder that behind every cold case is a real person, whose life mattered, whose death deserves answers, and whose memory deserves to be honored even when their name remains unknown. What do you think happened to the Isdal Woman? Do you believe she was a spy caught in Cold War intrigue, someone fleeing from danger? Or does another explanation make more sense? Share your theories in the comments below. Sometimes a fresh perspective or an overlooked detail can crack a case wide open. And if this story intrigued you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we'll continue exploring history's most baffling mysteries and the modern forensic techniques being used to solve them. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and let's keep searching for answers together.